Hello everybody, welcome to Talk It Out. I'm Jingping. Today I have a very special guest who I think is doing a very honorable job because by doing what he has been doing, sometimes he really put himself in danger. His name is Brian Baladic. He was a soldier at the US Marine Corps in his younger age, and then he moved to Thailand, working as an industrial designer. But what really got him in danger is his other job, geopolitical analyst.
The US's history of backing violent regime change and using its monopoly over international media to depict this sort of violence as peaceful pro-democracy protests and as crackdowns by despotic regimes is well established. They had done it more recently in Hong Kong and neighboring Myanmar, and they're doing it here in Thailand.
So over the past over 10 years, he's been exposing the foreign power-backed opposition movements in the world, especially in Asia. He used to use the pen name Tony Cartalucci, but since last year, he decided to reveal his real identity. Brian, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be having this discussion.
Actually, I watched quite a lot of videos on your channel, the New Atlas. You kept exposing the opposition movements in Thailand, in Myanmar, which were actually backed by the US government. But it's quite interesting because in your younger age, you were a soldier at the US Marine. So you were the one serving the country. And now you're exposing all these crimes of your government. So I'm quite interested, how come you changed from what you did before to now what you have been doing for more than 10 years?
Okay, well, I did. I joined the US Marine Corps at age 17, right out of high school. And it was because I wanted to serve my country. But what you end up finding out is that you're not actually serving your country, you're serving a very small handful of special interests. These special interests do not care what is best for other people around the world. That is obvious. And they also don't care about what's in the best interest of the people in America. When you sign up to join the US military, you take an oath to protect, defend the US Constitution, first and foremost, above even politicians. And what I saw, and actually what a lot of people in the military see, is that that is not what they're signing up for in actuality. And so when I started to realize this, as I saw evidence of this while I was in the Marines, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to get out. And I felt, and this was right before the invasion of Iraq, 2003. And I was so much against that I didn't even want to live in the US. And so I was stationed almost the entire time in Okinawa, Japan. And I had gone to Thailand once for about 3 months for this annual US joint exercise, Cobra Gold. And so I decided to go back to Thailand. I liked it a lot. I had already started learning the language in that short 3 months, and I couldn't think of anywhere else really to go. So I went to Thailand, and I have been living there more or less ever since. And so why I got into geopolitics and writing and now doing videos is because as the invasion of Iraq unfolded, you could see how the Western media was lying about everything, absolutely everything. Even when I was in the Marine Corps, fellow Marines, young Marines, senior Marines, they all knew that this was a lie. They knew there were no weapons of mass destruction there. And a lot of them, you couldn't say that they were actually for it, but they really had no choice, especially some of the older guys. They cannot stop, get out, and restart their life again. So they're kind of stuck doing it. And so watching the Western media lie on a daily basis about what was going on in Iraq and watching the US military brutalizing people in a country on the other side of the planet, it's so frustrating. And you see that, and then you start doing some digging. You start to notice what the US is doing in other countries. Because I was in Thailand, I started to notice what the US was doing inside of Thailand as well and in the region. And I just thought somebody has to speak up about it. So I'd say around 2010, 2011 is when I started writing on a regular basis. And it really got supercharged with the Arab Spring, because the year before that, the US tried to do the same thing in Thailand. So I watched the whole process unfold. And when I saw it happening again in the Middle East, I just felt this need to warn people about what was going on, how it wasn't spontaneous protests, how it was all engineered. And I wanted to show people the evidence of this, because even people that I had followed, people I thought were doing a good job, they were all missing this interference. It's not a direct intervention. It's very indirect and hidden. And so I wanted to show people how to dig and find that information. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And excuse me for asking more details about your previous job at the US Marine Corps. The reason I'm asking more detail is because we've all read the articles done by CNN. They were using apparently a fake Chinese policeman. It's apparently a fake Chinese policeman to all Chinese because there are so many loopholes. But they're using this fake policeman to justify or expose this human rights abuse in Xinjiang. So, and that person totally covered himself, the total identity, and then you see they also alter their voice, so you couldn't really hear what he was saying. So if I ask you, like CNN reporter, how can you prove you're actually a soldier at the US Marine Corps? How are you going to prove this?
I think, well, first of all, I mean, I have pictures. There are people who knew me while I was in the Marine Corps who could easily be asked and vouch for me. And my picture with them while we were in the Marine Corps, they have those pictures like on their Facebook. It's not very hard to dig and find this. But another thing you can do when someone claims that they're a police officer or former military is just let them talk a little bit about their work. And if they were there's certain things that they know or will say. Very obvious that they were in the Marine Corps. So I could describe, the whole process, the 3 months of basic training at Paris Island, another about a month doing Marine combat training, and then I was an electro-optical ordnance repairman, which means they trained me to fix the fire control systems on tanks, LAVs, the missiles, anti-tank missiles, the TOW missile, Javelin missile, night vision, infrared sights, a lot of things like that. It took a long time, about 9 months at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And then I went to Okinawa, Camp Hansen, Okinawa, and I spent pretty much my whole time there. And if another US Marine hears me saying this, they'll say, yeah, that guy sounds like he probably did that. I mean, I'm sure somebody could make that up, but then again, I have pictures, and my name must be somewhere in some record. The US is it's a pretty easy thing to find this information in the US.
And so when you were in Okinawa, what's your thought when you were based in Okinawa?
It's strange because when I first got there, I was completely brainwashed. I completely bought into the idea that the United States had to be everywhere to protect the world. And when we first got to the base, we were in a bus and we're going into the base. I saw Japanese people outside protesting. And I said, why are they protesting? Don't they know that we're here to protect them? And everyone around me agreed. They're like, yeah, what's wrong with them? But when you stay there, when you see the attitude of not just other Marines around you, young men who have a very bad attitude toward the local people, but also senior leadership, making specific decisions to kind of stick it to the Japanese people that they're there and they're the ones in charge, not in their own land. They're not the ones in charge. The US is. When I saw this, and you go out into town and you start to get to know Japanese people and Japanese culture, if you have an open mind, you start to feel kind of sorry for them that they've got these foreign military forces in their country. They do not respect them. A lot of times they're a source of crime, sometimes really atrocious crime. And it's just fundamentally wrong. The US would never tolerate another nation doing this to them, and yet they eagerly do this to others. And Japan is supposedly a US ally. And so that was part of my transformation, part of my waking up to, from the dream that we're out there protecting the Japanese people and the world, to the reality that it's an empire, just like all throughout human history. If a nation has its armies all over the planet, it's an empire. It's not benevolent.
Okay, so I think the experience in Okinawa was your first transformation. And you also mentioned the Iraqi war before. So was there like different phases of your transformation?
Yes. So I think when I first got, well, actually, when I first got to Paris Island for basic training, there was a little bit of a wake up where I realized a lot of the other men around me were not, they were not all there for the right reasons, I think. And some of these people got in because the US recruits people. There's not some sort of draft or anything. They voluntarily get recruited. And to fill the quotas, they lower the standards more and more every single year. And you get some people there that definitely should not be in the military for a variety of reasons. There are also really great people that join the US military. But that was a little bit of a wake up. Being in Okinawa and seeing how the US Marines treated the people living there in their own home, that was a wake up. And because I joined in 2000, in 2001, this was the September 11th attacks. And at the time I was really angry and I couldn't wait to get deployed and go to war, to fight for my country and fight against this enemy I thought we had. But they didn't send me, they didn't send my unit. And so I had time to think about it. And I thought, because I'm a big fan of the art of war. In the art of war, they say you need to know yourself and know your enemy. So I thought it would be a great idea to read through the Quran, because this is supposedly the source of this extremism that we were told is this threat. And when I read through the Quran, I realized the things the media, the Western media and Western politicians were telling us about Islam and Muslims were not true. These were cherry-picked verses out of the Quran. In context, it has a completely different meaning. And so I realized the whole thing is a lie. Why would they have to lie to us if it was true? Why, if they're really this bad and they're really our enemy, why would they have to lie like this? And so that was a really harsh wake up call. That was really like my eyes finally open. You know, like you're waking up in the morning, you can start to hear stuff. And this is when my eyes were finally open. And then the lead up to the Iraq, the final straw. And this is when I said, I cannot be part of this anymore. And that is when I fully woke up. There's still a lot to learn, obviously, but I was fully sure that I didn't want to be a part of this anymore.
And then you just didn't even live in the US. And then I think ever since that happened, that transformation, you moved to Thailand?
Yes. So I had to go back to the US to get out of the Marine Corps. And then I think my family understood and supported my decision. Mm-hmm. At the time, it didn't seem as obvious that the US was headed down the wrong road. Now my family fully understands it. And now they're like, Brian, you were right all this time. But yeah, I went to Thailand. I went back to the US for a short time because I had been in Thailand for years and hadn't seen my family. But then when my family started visiting me in Thailand, I have not been back to the US since. So I went only one time back to the US. And I lived in Singapore for about a year or so. And that's when I got into studying industrial design, which is actually my profession that I have chosen, that I actually want to do. This geopolitics is something I feel like I have to do. But I don't like doing it. It's really stressful. Sometimes you look at these horrible things that are going on around the world and you're one of the few people speaking up. It feels very daunting and almost futile, but you have to keep doing it because it's the right thing to do. So yeah, I've been in Thailand for 17, 18 something years about.
You just said it's something you have to do. Even though you don't enjoy it, you feel like someone has to do it. You have to do it. What was the reason that made you feel you have to speak up?
Well, number one, I live here and now I have a family here and I don't want my adopted home burned to the ground like the US did to Libya, Syria, Yemen, the way they destabilized and destroyed parts of Ukraine, what they're doing to Venezuela, Iran, even those violent mobs in Hong Kong. I do not want to see that here where I live and the people that I know who are my friends and my family being targeted by that sort of malicious violence and this malicious agenda. So that's a very selfish reason to do it. But then again, it's also just the right thing to do. If you see something wrong, you have to speak up about it, especially if no one else is doing it. And I'm the first to admit that I don't have much charisma. I don't like being in front of a camera. There's other people that could do this a much better job than I can. And I would be so happy if someone came along and just covered Southeast Asia, but nobody was. There's people that cover Latin America, the United States, Europe, Middle East, East Asia, but hardly anyone in English covers Southeast Asia. So I thought it was really important to cover this and show people how it's related to all of these other things.
I really need you to educate me about this because you're the one living in Thailand. You observe the whole situation. Can you share with us some of your observations during the protests in Thailand?
In 2010, because this is when I first started writing, I was covering the situation here in Thailand. So they had, what they call a color revolution, and these protesters were literally wearing red shirts. They were all wearing the same color shirt. And they kept saying it was about democracy. It's about democracy and human rights. And if you lived here in Thailand, you would know that they're actually fighting for this billionaire named Thaksin Shinawatra. So Thaksin Shinawatra got ousted in a coup in 2006. By 2010, he was trying to get himself back into power. And so they had these red shirts out in the street. The protest wasn't really going anywhere. So in order to escalate it, remember, this is 2010. In order to escalate it, they brought in these militants who started shooting up not only the riot troops, but also their own protesters to create a bloodbath. So this was April 10th, 2010. And there's even footage where there's a spotter moving this poor guy into position to get shot by one of their snipers. It's horrific, and it's so diabolical when you understand what you're looking at. And I was watching all of this, and then the next year was the Arab Spring, and they did all of these tricks in every one of these countries. And then the New York Times even admitted that this wasn't spontaneous. The National Endowment for Democracy was funding all of these opposition groups across the Arab world. Facebook was involved, the US State Department. They all had these technology workshops years ahead of time to train them up and then send them back to overthrow their respective governments. And then it was very obvious at first the Arab Spring looked like it was people rising up against the status quo, especially some of these governments that had a cozy relationship with the US. But then it became obvious the US was just reorganizing the entire region. And then the US then directly militarily intervened in Libya and Syria, and to a lesser extent, Yemen. So by the end of it, it was very clear. But in the beginning, it wasn't. And so understanding what the NED does and how it sets up the battleground for further intervention or regime change, this is so important, because if you can stop it there, you can stop all of the unnecessary death and destruction that comes with these fake revolutions and all of the interference the US engages in after they get traction and start moving things. So in Thailand, and then in neighboring Myanmar, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, in all of these countries in Southeast Asia, if you look at the State Department, decades ago, they openly admit that the goal is to encircle and contain China, and that Southeast Asia is one of 3 fronts they're doing this along. And so the goal is to get all of these governments out of power that have a good relationship with China and replace them with just a client regime that just irrationally hates China and cuts off ties with China, even if it means destroying the economy and destabilizing the region, kind of like what we see Australia doing now. It makes no sense, except if you're someone in Washington, then it makes perfect sense. And this is what I've been trying to expose, and no one else is talking about this. And now you can see, like with the Milk Tea Alliance, how all of these movements are all openly working together, from Hong Kong to separatists in Taiwan to Thailand, Malaysia, and now violent armed mobs in Myanmar. It's a united front, and it's all backed by the US. And it couldn't be clearer that that's what's happening now. And I've been trying for 10 years, because remember, back in 2011, as the Arab Spring was getting going, US Senator John McCain said, the Arab Spring is a virus and it's headed to Moscow and Beijing. He said it openly. I mean, it was obvious that they're going to do the Middle East, and then they were going to work their way into Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, with the ultimate destination being Moscow and Beijing.
So, I mean, from what's just told me about the protests in Thailand, I hear some similarities when the huge protests happened in Hong Kong. For different causes, of course, but you see some similarities. For example, the policemen, the Western media all saying how brutal the Hong Kong police are, but actually the Hong Kong policemen were the ones suffering the most. They didn't fire a single bullet, and they were being stabbed, attacked, encircled by a group of mobs. But none of that being mentioned by Western media contradict to what we saw. They are saying policemen were brutal, otherwise like being horrible towards other students. So I mean, I'm wondering, did you see any similarities between the protests in Thailand and the protests in Hong Kong?
Absolutely. In 2010, I would see these Western journalists out in the streets hiding behind tanks with the Thai army as the opposition with these militants trying to kill them. Some of these journalists did die. Some of them got hurt very bad by opposition war weapons. And these journalists would go back to their newsroom and say, oh, the Thai army is out in the streets killing mostly unarmed protesters, which when you really think about mostly unarmed means they're armed. It just means not everyone has a Kalashnikov, but some of them definitely do. And the military has an obligation to deal with that. That was 2010. This most recent wave of protests from 2014 onward was directly linked to the protests in Hong Kong, directly. If you look at the protest leaders here in Thailand, they have literally flown to Hong Kong to hang out with Joshua Wong and Nathan Law, literally. And they tried to have Joshua Wong come to Thailand to visit or do what, I don't know what he was planning on doing, but the Thai government turned him away at the airport. So they're definitely directly connected. The billionaire opposition leader here, Thanathorn Juangruangruangke, is a very long last name. He also went to Hong Kong and was posing for pictures with Joshua Wong. And because he was a sitting member of parliament in the Thai government at the time, he has since been ousted from that position. The Chinese government had to lodge a complaint because it's interference in China's internal political affairs. He had no right to do that, and he was doing that. And then when you start to understand that the National Endowment for Democracy is funding both mobs in Thailand, in Hong Kong, and you would say, hey, they're different reasons. They're protesting for different reasons, but not really. They have different excuses for why they're protesting. But the main reason they're protesting is to encircle and contain China. It's the exact same agenda. Thailand, Hong Kong, this is what unites them. This is the common denominator, being anti-Chinese and being being funded by the US government and trying to destabilize the whole region. And of course, the Milk Tea Alliance is kind of the formalization of this region-wide network the US is backing to do this. The Milk Tea Alliance with Twitter giving them their own official emoji. Again, the US social media has played a direct role in backing these opposition movements and creating a lopsided playing field for the opposition to make themselves look more popular and larger and to silence people trying to expose it. I mean, that's why they deleted me off of Facebook and Twitter, and they did this to many people, not just me. So yeah, they're directly connected. It's basically the same protest, just two different locations.
All this violence of the protesters won't be featured by the Western mainstream media. Same in Hong Kong, when those protesters stabbed people, set people on fire, killed an old janitor, and they were blocking the roads, stopped locals from going to work, who have many mouths to feed in their families, and were attacking, assaulting those people who don't agree with them, assaulting the family members of the policemen. Yet they were being called the peaceful protesters. They use violence because they want democracy so much. And yet the policemen protecting locals being called the brutal ones. I mean, just totally hypocritical.
It is, and you know, another similarity is how unpopular the mob is here in Thailand, and I think in Hong Kong it was not as popular as people tried to make it out. And in order to try to maintain the illusion, they would intimidate people who did not agree with them, and they would go out and attack them, try to ruin their businesses, expose them and where their family lives, make them feel threatened. And is that what a pro-democracy movement would do? And I have to say, though, that China is very lucky that they have their own social media networks, because social media is a battleground. And if it's within your own borders, I mean, it's like your airspace, your land borders, and your coasts. Your information space needs to be protected in exactly the same way. And for Thailand, who depends entirely on US-based social media, it's like having a foreign army in your borders, running everything, running who gets to use the roads and who doesn't. It completely makes it unfair and puts Thailand at a huge disadvantage there. Internet sovereignty is non-existent. I think China sets a good example on how to develop your own social media so that it could be used for the best interests of the people in that country, not people in Silicon Valley and their partners in Washington and on Wall Street.
Yeah, the reason like the Facebook was banned in China was because before we all could use Facebook, but in the year 2009, during the riots in Urumqi, basically all these terrorists, separatists were using Facebook to organize these attacks. So they're exchanging informations. Basically, the Facebook was the platform for for all the terrorists.
Yeah.
That's why, and they refuse to cooperate with the Chinese government to handle all those separatists, to handling all the information of the terrorists. They refuse to cooperate with China, so that it's too dangerous to have this platform in China now. So that's why Facebook was banned. But then none of that being mentioned by people in the West.
They never mention that, and they just act as if it's completely unfair to not have the US dominating the information space of every country on earth, which, when you really think about it, is completely crazy. And the US would never tolerate another country dominating its information space. And we have watched them shut down foreign companies, specifically citing that, but then denying other countries the ability to do that. And I have always said, and I try to tell this to my Thai audience, when they ask me what can Thailand do, and I said, if Thailand can buy helicopters, military helicopters from Russia, and main battle tanks and submarines from China, why can't they acquire a social media platform from Russia or China, who are both good at protecting their information space, and start working that into a national security policy? Because when you really think about it, your information space in the 21st century is as important as your airspace, your shores, and your land borders. And if you're not protecting your information space in the 21st century, you're not protecting your country at all. So I just hope that's something that maybe people in the government in China and in Thailand, I hope they think about that and think about it as a possibility, you know, to improve relationships. It could be something else that is a common ground to work together on. And it could also improve security throughout the entire region, because a destabilized Thailand or a destabilized Myanmar is a problem for everyone in the region, not just the country immediately affected.
It's interesting because you mentioned how they use the Southeast Asian countries, destabilize them, and in order to encircle China. Because I'm on Twitter a lot, and then from time to time, people will comment, see, China's big bully because they have disputes with all its neighbors. All the neighbors don't like China. So, I mean, you've been living in I've been to Southeast Asian countries a lot, like the Philippines, Vietnam. I've traveled to all these countries quite frequently before COVID. But as someone, you lived there for 15 years now, probably. So what's your observation? What's the relationship between China and all those countries?
Obviously, there is a lot of historical relations here in Southeast Asia with China. There's a lot from Chinese culture and history that is shared with a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. A lot of people living here know for sure about a certain percentage of their heritage that is actually Chinese, and they're proud of that. That's not something they're ashamed of. And over the years, when I first got here, you could tell that, you know, Thailand's main trading partners were the US and Japan, not China. And you could watch over the years how China has risen and how it has completely tilted the balance of power in the region. And it makes sense because China's by population the largest country in the world. And if all human beings are equal, why wouldn't the country with the most people have the largest economy? It's just common sense. But to the United States, it's an empire with a fraction of the world's population, and they're determined to run the entire planet. And the only way they can do that is by keeping everybody down. But getting back to China's relationship with Southeast Asia and Thailand in particular, I have watched the trade go up. I have watched the number of Chinese tourists flooding into Thailand. This is a very good thing. Before that, tourism, I mean, Thailand has a reputation for being a tourist sort of nation, but in reality, it was never like a disproportionate amount of the GDP. It was about average when you compare it to other countries around the world. And it was only when Chinese tourists started coming in large numbers that it became such a large percentage of the GDP. And again, that's like a very good thing. And the government is trying to get back to that because of COVID. And you'd watch all of the signs go from English and Japanese to Chinese and to a lesser extent Russian, because the demographics are changing all around the world. There's this shift of power from west to east, and you can see it every day, everywhere you go, incrementally, year by year. And a lot of businesses here in Thailand depend on China in many ways, especially as a source for products, especially for retail, and also as an export market. China is now Thailand's largest export market. So that's important to remember. And now two other very interesting recent developments is the Thai military buying Chinese weapons. So, and not little things either, main battle tanks. There's a submarine deal. This is a very major deal because when you buy a submarine, they're not just sending you a submarine. There's all kinds of training, support, and everything that comes with it. It's a complex system. And so this is illustrating how close these ties are getting and how big they're getting. There's also the high-speed rail link going from Kunming through Laos, which that line is already completed. It'll be operational in December of this year. And from Laos, Vientiane to Bangkok, that's already under construction. So this is a huge shift. If you came here 20 years ago and someone told you that this is what Thailand would look like in 20 years, you might not have believed it, but that this is what has happened. And this is what the US is trying to desperately reverse, which makes no sense, is highly destructive, just trying to do it. And what are they trying to stop, basically? Progress. Because even though the US and Japan had a lot of trade with Thailand, they were not really investing in infrastructure and things like that. It's China that has come in and raised all of these countries up with it as it's rising.
Yeah, indeed. For example, like 20 years in Afghanistan, they've spent billions of US dollars. But then after 20 years, most of the local people didn't even have enough water, running water or electricity, just some basic necessities. So where did all these billions of dollars go? So, and when they see some countries like Southeast countries are growing with the help of China, or like they're joining hands together to develop all together, and they want to destroy them. It doesn't make sense at all.
It doesn't make sense unless you are an imperialist and you understand that in order to be a powerful empire, you need to just keep everyone knocked down. If you're building infrastructure in a country that you're trying to subjugate, that infrastructure is going to make them stronger as a nation and more self-sufficient. So that's why the US never builds infrastructure anywhere. And people say, we're worried about China. They're going to become the next empire, or they're the only empire, because the US pretends it's not an empire. But what China is doing is building up countries that it works with. It's not dominating them. It's not lording over them. They're building them up. When these countries, say Laos, for example, with this high-speed rail link, that's going to improve their economy a lot. It's an impoverished country. They have no leverage, no power at all. This is the first time in recent history where they actually will have some kind of leverage, some kind of way to improve their standing economically. And the more money you have, the more say you have. So it's what the US is saying and what's actually happening are two different things. What you said about bullying is I think it's so funny. The US says China is this big bully in the South China Sea, especially. And when you actually live here, you read stories every month or so about all of these other countries fighting with each other in the South China Sea also, because what people don't realize is they all have overlapping claims. And this is common all around the world. The UK and France, for example, they fight over water and islands and stuff. So it's not something that is worth turning into a conflict. And the nations here, they all bilaterally work these things out. It doesn't even come close to becoming a conflict. The US is injecting itself into these minor disputes and trying to inflate them up as an excuse to stay here militarily and to just make problems with everybody. And say Vietnam, for example, the US acts as if they're such close allies with Vietnam, and Vietnam hates China so much. But I just watched China complete a metro project in Hanoi. They got a high-speed rail link going right up to the border. They gave Vietnam access to the China-Europe freight lines. So, there's all of these actual real things going on, and then what the Western media pretends is going on. They don't match up.
And also about yourself, because I think as the only person, only voice that is calling the US government out, calling the Western media out, you're probably going to face a lot of threats, or you really, like I mentioned in the beginning, you will put yourself in danger. So, you've been doing this for more than 10 years now. How was your voice being oppressed?
When I first started out, I was using a pen name, Tony Cartolucci, which you mentioned, and I decided to use a pen name because one, I didn't want credit for any of this. Also, I thought it was probably a good idea to be anonymous and not have everyone know who you are, because you're saying something that is really going against the grain, and people will come after you for it. Rhetorically, politically, they will come after you. But the only real direct threats that I ever got were by probably mentally ill individuals on social media. I think everyone has crossed paths with people like that. But the reason I decided to come out and use my real name was, one, Facebook and Twitter on the very same day deleted all of my accounts, not just my political accounts, but also my accounts in my real name, which means they obviously knew who I really was. So someone out there censoring me to silence me knows exactly who I am. So what good does being anonymous do in those circumstances? And then the deciding moment was when the US Embassy here in Bangkok repeatedly, they didn't say my work directly, but they said an English blog talking about US interference. So who else could that possibly be except for me? And they were saying basically I'm just a liar, and it's not true. Even though you can go to the NED's website and see all the core organizations listed there with money amounts in US dollars that the US government gives them annually. So I thought it was a good idea to come out under my real name so people knew who I was. So in case anything at all happened to me, they would know what happened, instead of if I remained anonymous and the only people who really knew who I was were people interested in silencing me. That is not a good idea. Mm-hmm. And now I can do videos. For anyone who thought they were intimidating me or trying to silence me, all this does is make me more determined. And I'm reaching far more people now doing my videos than I ever did with my articles. So I don't know. It just seems like a counterproductive strategy when dealing with all of this to try to just silence people. I was never really directly threatened by, say, the US Embassy. But if you look at what the US does around the world, even to their own citizens or to people like Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, who was a former soldier and an American citizen who's now in permanent exile, what they did to Daniel Hale, who exposed the atrocities behind US drone warfare, Chelsea Manning. If that's what they do to people they don't like, and they're saying they don't like me, you can make an easy jump to worrying about them doing something to you.
And also, I've noticed your recent contents, your recent videos shift focus from, like, say, events in Thailand, Myanmar to Xinjiang autonomous region in China. You did quite several videos exposing the lies made by Western media, by government, in researching to how the U.S. government basically funded those separatists. So, I mean, how come you choose your focus to Xinjiang now? This is like a hit topic, and it's sometimes it can be dangerous to talk about because you're saying something different from the Western mainstream media, different from U.S. foreign policy. You will be called a genocide denier or all those labels, you know. So why you decided to step into this?
The interesting thing is I didn't just start talking about Xinjiang recently. I have been actually writing as Tony Cartolucci about Xinjiang for years and years before it was ever a topic, like a big topic. I had been writing about the World Uyghur Congress, all of these NED-funded organizations before any of this started. So, I mean, I'm talking about it now because it's now a major focus for the US propaganda war against China. So obviously I'm going to talk about it, but I had been writing about it for years before a lot of people even noticed that this was an issue. Because what you do, once you find out, once you understand that the NED is behind all of these groups, when you see anything in the news at all, anything at all, because
this is the National Endowment for Democracy. It was created by the US government. It is funded annually by the US government. It is overseen by Congress and the US State Department. And what they do is they fund political interference of regime change operations all around the globe, including in China. And their operations in China are so extensive, they have to break them down into regions. So this is the Xinjiang/East Turkestan region. And East Turkestan, in case you don't know, is the word that separatists and terrorists call Xinjiang, China. The international community recognizes Xinjiang as part of China. They do not recognize this East Turkestan. And so who's the US government funding through the NED? Many organizations, including World Uyghur Congress. So when World Uyghur Congress says the money came through them to fund this tribunal, they're talking about US government money.
Focusing on it because at that time there were still terrorist attacks in Xinjiang. I saw the connection with Baluchistan in Pakistan and the Rohingya issue in Myanmar. I could see how the US was using all of these crises, engineered crises, and US-backed subversion and separatism. I could see how they were using it to attack China directly and attack China's allies and partners for the Belt and Road Initiative.
So basically you saw this coming, you predicted this.
Yes, like many years ago. People should go to my old blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com, and just type in the search box and you will see articles from like 2011, maybe something as far back as that, because when John McCain said it's going to Russia and China, I immediately started researching everything to do with Russia and China and how they might be undermining both countries the same way they were doing in the Middle East with the Arab Spring and the same way they were doing here in Thailand.
Is there anything else that you want to share that you think is important to share but I haven't asked?
I just think it's important for people to understand how powerful and dangerous this anti-China propaganda is, because I see it here in Thailand. I see, luckily these mobs are very small, very unpopular, but it's hard to gauge how many kids are sitting at home on social media who don't believe in it enough to go out, but their minds are being poisoned by all of these lies. So we had Louisa Grieve from the National Endowment for Democracy, and now she works for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. She actually came to Thailand, went to Chulalongkorn University, joined this activist named Netwit, who has gone to the Oslo Freedom Forum, and he's one of these US-backed or US-adjacent activists. And they had a whole seminar on repeating all of these lies about Xinjiang and poisoning the Thai youth against China. And you have to think, when you look at how important China is to the entire region, economically, culturally, historically, poisoning this is like turning children against their parents or cousins against one another. It's really sinister, and it could cause long-term unnecessary damage. I think it's important for people to understand that and to speak up against it. It's not something that's going to go away. It's something that once these people are poisoned, it's very hard to convince them otherwise.